All right, so this video here is going to talk about actually being able to visualize and see the gains from trade in our model of international trade based on comparative advantage. So we're going to actually show the gains from specialization and trade. So we have an example here with the US and Canada again. And now what I've laid out here are the production possibilities. These are not the productivities of labor. They are the production possibilities of our two countries. And I'm going to help make this very visual. So I've changed the numbers a little bit here. But remember, when you have these numbers here, the total productivities, you can't figure out the absolute advantage because it combines the resources in each country and the productivity of those resources. But you can't figure out the opportunity cost, and the opportunity cost would simply be based on, again, the ratios of this. So you take the quantity of bread divided by the quantity of steel, and that's the opportunity cost of steel. So that would be 1/2 for the United States, and then their opportunity cost of bread would be 2. In Canada, I've changed the numbers around here. So the opportunity cost for Canada of steel would be 2 units of bread, the 60 divided by 30, and the opportunity cost of bread would be 1/2 a unit of steel. So those are the numbers there. When you calculate the opportunity cost, then the country with the lowest opportunity cost has the comparative advantage. For steel, that's the United States, because 1/2, their opportunity costs are 1/2 versus 1/2 for the United States versus 2 for Canada. I want to do it that way. And then for Canada, their opportunity cost of bread is lower than the opportunity cost for Canada. So then what we can do is come down here and graph these production possibilities curves. I'm going to graph them both on the same graph because I've picked the numbers here so it can work out and look pretty good. So we'll draw one here. Canada's PPC goes from 60 for bread down to 30 for steel. And we look like that, and that's Canada. I'll just put a C here so we know that that's Canada. And then the U.S. production possibility curve goes from 30 to 60. There it is. And we have that here. And that's the U.S. Okay, now to show gains from trade, we have to know what each country would produce and consume in autarky. So let's just assume here, because it helps to make the numbers work out here, let's just assume that in each country, consumers want these goods in equal numbers. So consumers in each country would like to consume equal amounts of bread and steel. Equal amounts. If you want to graph that then, a curve in this graph that would represent equal amounts of the two goods would be the 45-degree line, because it would be coming along here. Oh, we'd have 30 and 30, and that point would be on this curve, and 60 and 60 would be on there, and so on. So what we can do is just add this in here with this, and this is the 45-degree line, and I've just made this up. But what we're saying here is that this is where consumers would like to be. They would like to have equal quantities of bread and steel. It depends ultimately on their preferences. In microeconomics, we could go into more detail of this with or known as indifference curves and be able to derive demand. So these preferences are ultimately, if you want to think about it, supply and demand. The preferences are ultimately driving demand curves for these goods. And what we're really sort of saying, the important thing, because it allows us to complete this out and see the gains from trade, is that consumers in both countries would like to have equal quantities of these goods. Now, before the United States and Canada can trade with each other, they have to produce and consume for themselves. That's autarky. So in autarky, they have to be on their own production possibilities curves. And then the consumers want to be at the point along there that's on the 45-degree line. So that happens to be here, and the numbers work out that both countries would want to be, actually at this point here, because the way I've picked this, these production possibilities curves happen to intersect each other at the same point that they intersect the 45-degree line, and you could work it out here that each country would want to, in autarky, produce at the point on their production possibilities curve where they would be producing 20 units of bread and 20 units of steel, because then that's what they have to consume. They can't trade, and that gives consumers what they want. Now, let's consider international trade. When these two countries realize they're next to each other and they can trade, they have the possibility of trading. Now, it says in the book that it discusses how the price for international trade has to work out to be between the opportunity costs of the two different countries here. So the U.S.'s opportunity cost is 1/2. Canada's opportunity cost of steel is 2. Those numbers there for steel, because steel's on the x-axis. So 1/2 and 2, what's in between there? Oh, 1 is in between there. So I set this up so we could use a consumption possibilities frontier representing a price of 1 between these two, a price ratio of 1. So bread and steel would have the same price per unit. If you're concerned that bread is small compared to steel, remember we can change the units here. We can say that a unit of bread could be a ton of bread, and then versus a pound of steel to get that equal. But we would have to have a price of 1. And if we have a price of 1, then we'd have a consumption possibilities frontier that is flatter than Canada's PPC and steeper than the United States' PPC. If you look at my video that I did for the consumption possibilities curve, we said that we were able to show there that if a nation in international trade faces a CPC that's steeper than their PPC, then they want to produce down at this end. They want to produce all of the good on the x-axis. If they face a CPC that's flatter than their PPC, then for profit maximization, they are going to want to produce producing only all of the good that's on the y-axis. So I'm going to draw, that tells us the U.S. is going to produce 60 units of steel, and that's what they have to sell in the international market. And Canada is producing 60 units of bread, and that's what they have to sell, and whatever they don't sell to the United States, they get to keep for themselves. So we have a CPC that has to be anchored from the U.S.'s point where they're going to be producing. That's here with specialization, and Canada with specialization is up here. And it happens to turn out, because I set up the number this way, the CPC with international trade at this price of 1, which again, it has to be somewhere between 1/2 and 2, so all I happen to say is 1, and it actually turns out with these numbers and these preferences for consumers, this would have to be it. But it would work out here, and so here's the consumption possibilities frontier. The U.S. faces this and can trade. If they trade steel for bread to Canada, they can move up and to the left along this CPC. And Canada starts from here, and if they want to trade bread to the United States to buy steel, they can move down and to the right along this consumption possibilities curve. Now it just so happens then that where this 45-degree line intersects is right here. And it would turn out that those numbers would be 30 and 30. So what we would see is that the U.S. produces 60 units of steel, and then at a price ratio of 1-for-1, they want to trade 30 units of steel for 30 units of bread. The U.S. would want to sell 30 of their units of steel and buy 30 units of bread. And then it turns out that that's exactly what Canada would want to do as well. We don't really want to get into the equilibrating stuff that's going on with prices, but it would turn out in this case this is what it would have to be. But that's more you have to worry about. But the point is, we have this CPC here. We know that profit maximization. Profit maximization drives Canada to be here. U.S. drives profit maximization drives their producers to want to be here, and then they can carry out this trade of 30 steel for 30 bread, They both move from where they produce to here, and they get to this point here. Now, what we can look at here is where both countries were in autarky, and here's where they are with trade. So the principle of comparative advantage says if nations specialize in producing the good that they have the comparative advantage in, and then trade with each other, both nations can be better off. And that's what we see here. The United States has comparative advantage in steel. Canada has comparative advantage in bread. In autarky, they have to try to both produce both of the goods because they have to, if they want to consume both goods, they have to produce them themselves. So in autarky, both countries happen to be here. With trade, with specialization, the United States moves down here to produce here. Canada moves to produce all bread up here. And then they trade, and so with trade, they end up with 30 units of each. In autarky, each country had 20 units of bread and 20 units of steel. With trade, they each have 30 units of bread and 30 units of steel. We've got the same number of people in both countries, so on that basis, we would say that both Canada and the United States have to be better off. They have each been able to get to a point that's outside of their production possibilities curve. That a point that would be infeasible for them to try to produce at themselves. The only way they can get there is through international trade. And so this is the basis from which economists always want to say specialization along the lines of comparative advantage and trade can make both parties better off. And that's an important point as well. A lot of people, especially from political science or international relations, they maybe haven't studied enough economics, and they might think that trade between nations is zero-sum. If trade between nations is zero-sum, then if one nation is benefiting from trade, the other must be losing because gains and losses have to sum to zero. But both parties can be better off. International trade is what we want to call a positive sum game. It's a win-win situation. Both countries can be better off, and that's what we can see here. And if there's one thing you remember 10 years from this class, 10 years from now from this class, it's this demonstration here how specialization in trade based on comparative advantage makes both parties better off. International trade can make all the participants, both the countries that are participating in it, better off.